Good morning. And I am today a very lucky person because I am with Eavan Brady from Ireland.
Hello, Lisa. How are you?
I'm very, very good. It's so good to have you here. So, Eavan is a social work lecturer and has just completed her PhD around educational trajectories of adults who were looked after in Ireland. So anyone who knows about the work that I've been doing will know that that's really exciting for me, because even though we asked quite different questions, we found
Mhm.
very similar things, which is very interesting when I did my master's research. So I don't really know, where do we begin? I mean, first of all, you've finished a PhD. That in itself, just like, I mean, oh hail, oh hail. Amazing. Just tell us a little bit. I mean, just tell us just for a moment what that actually feels like to kind of lock. You haven't got a beard, so you didn't have to lock yourself away.
No, I haven't got a beard, thankfully. No, I mean it's quite surreal, Lisa, to be honest with you, because I started working on this PhD in 2014, so it's like 5 years in the making, and I've had a daughter in the meantime, and I'm about to have my second child in a few weeks. So in a way, that was the motivator. Get it done. I need to get it done before I have this baby. But it's a strange thing as well to kind of finish a project that you've worked on for so long and feel like you can't really. Not that, I will continue to work on the data, absolutely, no question. There's so much there that I didn't use. You can only fit so much into the PhD, but yeah, it's kind of like just you have to let it go and let it sit and send it to the examiners and let them do what they will with it, which is a bit of a strange feeling, I suppose. But it's hugely exciting to think that all the interviews that I did and the people that I spoke to, those stories are kind of now, they're in journal articles, and they've been pulled together into this one big document. So it's very satisfying from that perspective to think that you start with an idea and you actually execute it. I don't know how often that happens.
Well, it's another baby, isn't it? I mean,
Yes, yes.
and they're going off to school now. They're going off to journals, and they're going off to school.
Into the big bad world, exactly.
Yeah. So tell me, what was your motivation? What's your passion? What led you to have? I mean, I know what drives me, and I guess as part of going through the ethics process in doing your PhD, you will have had to have a look at where you're located and what you bring to the research party.
Mm.
So tell
Mm-hmm.
us what's sat underneath your passion.
Yeah, yeah, and I think that's such an interesting question, and it's one I kind of came back to again at the end as I was writing up, more formally my PhD. Because I knew why I came to it originally, and then I was thinking, oh, that's amazing to look at why I came to it and why I'm here now. So I guess there's a few reasons. I spent a lot of time working in the homeless services in Ireland and housing services in Toronto. I lived in Canada for 3 years, and with that experience and a couple of other pieces of experience I had, I suppose I met a lot of people who had grown up in the care system, who'd spent time in the care system, and were in various, I suppose, stages in their lives. Some of whom were hoping to return to education, some of whom had no interest in education, some of whom had very negative experiences of education. So I kind of, something was kind of triggered in me then, because my own education has always been it's been such a huge part of my own life, and really formative part of my life, I suppose, as well. And my parents have been incredibly supportive of my education. I'm very lucky in that regard. And I suppose I was learning about all these different experiences people had had. And I lived in Canada for 3 years, as I said, and I worked on a program called the Bookworm Club there, which is similar to the Letterbox Club, which I'm not sure if you know, but it's a book gifting program for children in foster care. So I worked on that for 2 years, and worked on the evaluations of that, and really learned a lot about how simple things or things like having access to books, things like reading really can appear to make such a difference. And then I trained as a social worker as well. So I think those kind of combined experiences, my own interest in education, my own kind of passion for education and learning and continuous learning, lifelong learning, I became really curious about, on my kind of exposure to the literature, I suppose, as well. I became really curious about, well, what actually happens after the age 24, 25, 26, because so much of the literature, as I'm sure you know, is focused on and in many ways that's not a criticism, it's just, it's kind of the way things are, but a lot of the literature around education focuses on those immediate years just after young people have left care. And I was kind of curious to think, well, there's a lot going on around that time, so I wonder if you spoke to people a little bit later. And I haven't spoken to people hugely later, but even just those few years later, so 25, 26, I spoke to people who were between 24 and 36. So I was curious to see if that little passing of time made any kind of a difference in terms of people's educational experience and what had kind of shaped and informed that. So that was a very long-winded answer to your question, but I think a lot of things led me to the point of pursuing this PhD. And I was very lucky to have, my supervisor was Professor Robbie Gilligan in Trinity, who's kind of always been so vocal and has done a huge amount of research around aftercare and children in care. So I was very lucky that he was happy to take me on as a PhD student as well. So I think a lot of things kind of lined up, and yeah, I guess that they're kind of the many and varied reasons that led me to do this PhD research.
That's fantastic, and I don't want to just let slip into the air and wander off the fact that you met so many people with a care history when you were working around homelessness. I think, I just don't want to let that slip off, really. So you looked at 24 to 36, and my research looked at 44 to 60.
Oh, that's so cool, isn't it?
It is so cool. You're absolutely right. Yeah, it is so cool. have a just to sort of really look across that life course. But what was your question? What was your PhD question?
Oh, I love it. I had two questions. So my first question was, what are the educational pathways of care experienced adults? And my second question was, now I might be quoting it slightly wrong because you think it's all in there forever, but it might be gone a little bit. How can the life course perspective shed light on some of the factors that might influence and shape those educational pathways? So I used a life course perspective kind of as a guiding research paradigm, a framework for my study, and the life course perspective, as I'm sure you know, but it's really kind of an integrative framework for looking at development over the life course, and it really emphasizes this long-term perspective and the role of individual and structural and cultural factors. So I was curious to see how this kind of theoretical framework could help to inform what had shaped and influenced those pathways, but before that to see, well, what actually are those pathways? And I'm a big fan of simple research questions. I teach research methods to masters and social work students, and I'm always saying the simpler the better, the simpler the better. So I think that what are the educational pathways one really was kind of the primary one, I suppose, and then because I needed to have that established before I could look at, well, what are the factors that have influenced those pathways, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. So let's just take a pathway of very disrupted, so let's just recap what those 4 pathways were. So
yeah,
go on.
Do you want me to do it? Yeah.
Sorry. I don't want to get them wrong. I've read them, but go on.
No, that's okay. So I interviewed 18 people, and I identified these 4 pathways in my analysis. And so, as I should say, not everybody fits nice and neatly into the pathways, but as a way of kind of grouping and getting a bit of a structure on it, these are the pathways that I identified. So you had the typical pathway, which was fairly kind of normative pathway, I suppose, where people finish compulsory education, their secondary school, as we call it here, and then pursued higher education. So going from school to university, effectively. And there was only 3 people in that group. I think the numbers on this are actually quite important. And then the second group was called, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, well, just what's really interesting is you're saying there was only 3 people out of the 18 in that group. Fairly reflective of the data that we would have that gives us it gives us, if we use Neil Harrison's research, it gives us 11.8% going on to university at a very traditional rate. So that's really interesting. So go on, the second category.
Yeah, you're right. I love that. Yeah, you're totally right. So the second category then I called the typical pathway plus. So these were people who had a fairly typical experience as well, but they had this extra year. So when they finished their compulsory education, they did a year of what we call in Ireland, it's a post-leaving cert course. It's a type of further education. So they finished their secondary education, they did a year post-leaving cert course and then went into higher education. So they kind of had this bridge, I suppose, between compulsory and higher education. And again, only 3 people did that, which I think is also interesting, because that's a fairly typical pathway. There's not a huge gap, there's no real break in terms of the flow of their education, I suppose. It's just a kind of alternative route. And then the 2 biggest groups, which I think is interesting, and in light of what you're talking about with Neil Harrison's work, it's a really excellent point. We had these kind of more disrupted pathways. So there were 6 people I spoke to who had short-term disrupted pathways and 6 who had long-term disrupted pathways. So when I say short-term disrupted, these were people who were out of education for between 1 and 3 years. And actually, interestingly, I think it was 4 of that group had actually left school early. So in Ireland, you have to stay in education until the age of 16. So these are people who had left, I suppose, slightly early. So between the ages of 14 and 16, these people had left education. 4 of them had, I should say, sorry. And then that group had spent between 1 and 3 years out of education. And then the long-term disrupted had spent anywhere from 3 to over 10 years out of education. And I think a really interesting thing about those 2 groups is the range of different things that were going on for people in those years out of education. So some people became parents, some people were working, some people experienced homelessness and addiction. And a lot of different things spurred people to go back into education. So there was a lot of diversity in terms of what was going on for people. And yet these kind of 1 to 3 years and 3 to 10 years patterns were very, very visible within the data. And I really do think it's important to note that, 2/3 of the sample, so I mean, it's a small study, relatively speaking, I suppose, but 2/3 of the 18 had these disrupted pathways. And ultimately, the group of people I spoke to, I think for the most part, could be considered, I don't really, these words I sometimes grate a little bit, but successful, they're terms that are used a lot in literature, and they would be considered successful, I think, because most of the people I spoke to had ultimately pursued further and higher education. And a lot of them were and had completed master's degrees, so.
Well, so good to hear you say that, because that was my finding as well. I mean, because mine was a master's, I had 5 people, and
yes,
4 of them had gone on to were over master's educated, and I
amazing.
think it is really amazing and it is really incredible. But I think both of our research actually poses a little bit of a tension. So I don't know what the situation is in Ireland, but we have virtual schools. I do lots of work with virtual schools. Do you have
We don't have that model, no, but I'm fascinated by it. Yeah.
It's a brilliant model, and I think it has helped and supported and challenged and shifted so much for looked after children in the school system. So I'm a big fan of virtual schools, and I will be pointing them to this podcast. So interested in your work. But the tension is that there's this continuing pressure to raise the standards and raise the levels of attainment and achievement and outcome for that cohort of young people. When most of the research, all of the research we're looking at now is a clear indicator that actually we need longer, we need more life, more, we need the things that need to be settled for us to be stable. There is a percentage that perhaps have had less disruption in their care experience, who are more able to perhaps be that traditional route. But how do we meet that tension without then going back to a period of time where education is somehow seen as, well, don't worry about that, they'll do it later anyway, we don't need to focus on that? I mean, how do we sort of manage that tension? I mean, is that something that's come up for you in your thinking about this?
Yeah, and I think that's so interesting, because I think the way that is reflected in the Irish case, one way that I think that what you're describing there, that kind of pressure might be reflected in the Irish case, is related to our aftercare policies. So here, young people leaving care are eligible for an aftercare plan up to the age of 21. But if they're in full-time education, that can be extended, and aftercare service can be extended to the age of 23. But they have to be in full-time education. And I think what this study, and certainly from the sounds of it, your own work as well, is showing is that, well, I mean, that's certainly it's a great thing to be encouraging people into full-time education if possible. But what about the many people, or the apparently, it seems like there's many people, and it seems like this diversity, I would suspect that it's not uncommon. Those kind of policies that have this kind of inherent condition about them miss out a huge amount of people. And I think the messaging around that, you know, if you're not done by 23, that's kind of it, is not in keeping with, you know, there's narratives of lifelong learning and, you know, continuing education and all that in the wider population, and it doesn't really, it's kind of this mismatch, isn't it? So I think certainly, you know, it's a tricky position, because I think my study, I'm so proud of it, but I also realise that from a policy perspective, people will want bigger studies, bigger information and that kind of thing. And in Ireland, we're not great on collecting data around children in care. We really don't have any clear indication in terms of the education outcomes of children in care here at all. Yeah, which is, you know, when you look to the likes of England and Wales and Scotland, and even in Northern Ireland, actually, you know, there's yearly reports, you know, they're not necessarily hugely detailed sometimes, but there are reports, and that's something that there's a big gap there in the Irish context, you know. So
I never thought I'd hear somebody looking to England in the way that you just did. We spend so much of our time going, have you seen what they're doing in Wales? Have you seen what they're doing in Scotland? You know, but you have just said, that's the first time anyone's ever said to me what you're doing in England. Wow. Yeah, I mean, it's true, because that data is a point of reference, is a space to come back to, and you know, when you say we don't have data at all, that's really shocking. I mean, that's like a massive campaign piece that isn't collected. I mean, it's unbelievable.
Yeah. I know, and I mean, there are people, groups and that kind of thing, advocating for it and stuff like that. And myself and Robbie have written a couple of pieces around that, and we actually had a recent paper where we analysed. We have this program here called Higher Education Access Route, which is it's kind of like an access. I think you have access programs in England, I'm sure. Yeah. So it's an access program where if you have spent time in care, you are automatically eligible for this access route. So we were actually able to access data from the last couple of years around the care group within that who had entered higher education through that access program, and that was a really interesting opportunity to really highlight the fact that this was the first piece of, you know, evidence that we had around children in care and young people who've been in care in terms of their and we didn't even get to the point of seeing how they did in education. It was about, did they apply for this, and did they get offered a place? We didn't even know if they took up the place. But it was, you know, we kind of, the paper is about that data, but it's also about this fact that we really have this massive glaring hole, and it's very difficult to, you know, write policy and develop practice around something when you don't know what you're dealing with, really. And I think a lot of people have what's the word? Like, I'm sure a lot of people intuitively have a sense of what's going on, and also the fact that I'm sure there's lots of people here in the care system who are doing very well in education. I'm sure that there are many who are, but that doesn't, I suppose, negate the fact that you will have people who aren't doing so well. But also we just need to know. Like, if we don't know, how can we start to address it as an issue, you know? So
it's another kind of route to silencing, you know, when you're talking about that. Yeah. You know, it's not that government statistics capture voice, because they really don't. It's very flat, bland, dry information. But what it does do is it opens up a space to say that these people exist, and this is what's happening for this particular group of people, and then layering that with research that means that you can then embed voice and people's ownership of what has happened for them, to them, with them in that educational context is so vital. I mean, it's just to listen to you say that, I just got that real, I mean, I was in care in the 80s, and that whole date, you know, that's how it was. There wasn't that kind of there was certainly no joined up thinking around education and care. And Jackson's work, who I know you'll have read to death, really brought the two things together.
Oh, yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
she's that first person really wandering about research departments going, why is this separate? You know, how do we bring education and care of these looked after children together? Otherwise, these trajectories are never going to change. I mean, as it turns out, we can look back and reflect on that and say, well, that was only one piece of the jigsaw, but it was a bloody big piece.
Yeah, yeah. And her work, I think it's really interesting to look at kind of how far England has come. And I say England because that's one in my head, but how even since like the 80s and 90s, that's like 20-30 years ago, the leaps towards having like virtual schools, having these, you know, the Recentre doing work where they're connecting data from education and care, like it's just incredible. I mean, it gives me a lot of hope that, you know, maybe things like that will be able to be developed in Ireland. But I think that idea of, you know, something my supervisor has said in many different contexts, you know, we measure what we treasure. So, you know, the messaging, as you were saying, around if we're not measuring this, and I appreciate there's so many other things that, you know, there's a lot of competing issues and there's always something that needs to be done. But, you know, these are children, young people and adults who are children of the state, you know, and the state and us, you know, I include myself, citizens of the state are responsible for them in many ways, you know. And I think that that's a real it actually just makes me feel really sad sometimes when I think about it, because I just think the message around that like we've not even collecting the data. Not to say that there aren't a lot of people who are kind of campaigning and arguing for the fact that we should. So I think it's important just to mention that it's not that no one cares about it. Certainly there's lots of groups and lots of advocacy groups in Ireland, like Epic and things like that, who are vocal about these kind of things. But, you know, it's a long road.
Listen, the message is very, very clear. You know, imagine not caring about the education of your children. I mean, the message could have a much more clear underpinning. And I don't want to labour the point, because I didn't know that. I didn't know that those figures were not measured. And that has just kind of gone,
Yeah.
And you know, the whole corporate parenting space is complicated, because as even in something like this that's highlighted its inadequacies. I mean, there are so many inadequacies of the idea of being a child of the state or a corporate parent. But if this is not saying very clearly what happens to your education is of no interest to us at all, it is about as far removed from parenting as one can possibly get. And it needs to be a priority, up there with all the competing priorities.
Yeah.
But I'm going to move us away from there, because that's quite a sad space, and I don't want either of us to kind of hang out there for too long. Because actually, the good news story is that, you know, you have done this fantastic research that highlights the fact that once there has been a period of stability, adults with that background have an opportunity. And actually, even what I found, because mine was about school exclusion, even having experienced exclusion, formally or informally or both, the passion for education was not lost. And I thought that was such a powerful and beautiful message. And even if there is that tension about achievements and actually that might have to come later than the school system would like, the key message is keep doing what you're doing and planting those seeds and being the key relationship, so that when people revisit it later on, they've got that the seeds within them to go and do that.
Yeah, exactly. And actually, it's interesting you should raise kind of the idea of relationships and key people, and also kind of the role of the person themselves in that, you know, that determination and things. There's a paper that is hopefully going to be out reasonably this week, I think, in Child and Family Social Work, based on my PhD findings as well. And it's all about the role of key actors in supporting the educational progress of the people I spoke to. And it draws on the life course perspective, the concept of linked lives, so that interconnectedness that we have over time. And some of the things that came out of that, which I think are kind of relevant in light of what you're saying, is this idea that actually opportunities for support, encouragement, and you know, really promoting people's kind of ambitions, I suppose, was present like throughout the narratives of people across the life course. It wasn't as if it doesn't happen in childhood, it's over. You know, there was this constant opportunity. And I think the idea of that intergenerational piece as well was quite important in that study. So people having maybe a birth parent who was actually very vocal about the importance of education, and instilling that value of education, and that they might not have had contact with that birth parent for a long time, but that still somehow stuck. And also on the other side of that, people who had their own children then developing this, you know, really powerful sense of determination and motivation, and, you know, I'm going to do everything I can to give my child this better life, or whatever it is. So that was a huge feature in my research, the role of other people, and the role of the individuals themselves. I have another paper around the idea of agency and how that was kind of emerged in the data, but that's still under review, so I won't say anything about that yet. But I think it was certainly, like, you can't talk about education without talking about how other people play a part in it. I mean, I mentioned my own family when I was talking about what brought me to the study. You know, I think it's one of those things that is just inherently wrapped up in many ways in what other people say to you, the messages you get, and all that kind of thing.
Well, most of the work that I do has the heading relationships are everything, you know. relationship. I mean, it's all about that. And again, in my research, what was really interesting was that for everybody bar one, that person, that, because I asked them the specific question, was there a key person that you remember, you know, that really that you draw upon thinking about yourself educationally? And no, not even draw upon thinking about educationally, because I didn't want to lead people down the teacher path. But they all chose a teacher, apart from one who chose a social worker who taught them maths and English. So there's something about, there's something about caring about someone's education as an expression of care, which I just think is really interesting. But I'm also curious, I can't wait for your other paper to come out around agency, because I do a lot of stuff around Anne Maston's work and resilience, and her study found that there was this motivation to succeed and efficacy, so agency. And I'm really curious about, where does motivation come from? You know, if that resilience built in layers based on the relationships and the resources around us and the context, motivation the same? And where does agency come from? So I'm going to be looking at your paper to see what your findings were, but you can't tell me over the podcast.
I hope you're not disappointed. We'll do another interview when that comes out.
We will. I'm going to hold you to that. That'll be so.
But just one thing on that, because I think it's good, where does motivation come from? And this isn't in any way, this isn't the essence of the paper or anything like that. But one big thing that did come out when I was talking to people was a motivation to actually prove other people wrong was very powerful for a lot of the people I spoke to. So, you know, that teacher who said, you know, you're never going to do anything, or, you know, the foster parent or whoever, somebody who had conveyed even a really seemingly small comment or you know, throwaway comment that had really stuck with the person. I think there was maybe 8 or 9 people I spoke to who actually, and I didn't ask a question about what motivates you, it just kind of came up in the conversation. So I just thought that was really interesting. And I think the important thing about that is that can obviously also work the other way. It doesn't always act as a motivator, that kind of negative comment, you know. And I think if you ask anybody, they can tell you, oh, I had an Irish teacher, or, you know, everyone has a story about a teacher who told them they wouldn't do something well. And I think depending on the individual, and those ideas of resilience and self-efficacy are so relevant there, you know. But I just thought that was really interesting, and you know, it gave a really, I thought the insight that provided was really important one to kind of take away and hold on to. Personally anyway, I found it quite an important one.
Yeah, no, I agree, and I think that that's something that I certainly came up with.
Okay.
And there is something interesting there. We do need to be cautious, because, of course, we don't want people who are particularly punitive wandering about going, oh well, it'll maketh the person, you know.
Yes.
No. I know. There are people out there. You know, we're well within our education system. But yeah, there is something really interesting about what we bring what we bring to the party in terms of our development. What do we bring? And why is one person's motivator another person's lying down on the floor weeping, you know?
Absolutely. Yeah.
So there's it is really interesting thinking about that.
Yeah.
So, I mean, God, we've covered so much. I mean, is there anything else that you just want to throw in, you know, like your key finding that's just going to really change everything? I mean, do you have
everything? I think the one kind of big takeaway, I think, from especially from the paper we're talking about, the one about pathways, I think the importance of kind of starting from that point of expecting diversity and expecting alternative pathways and anticipating that and supporting that, and you know, because I think that was really the norm. This diversity was the norm within this group of people that I spoke to. And yes, there was these 4 groups, but you know, they had very different pathways. When you get into the nuances of it, they had a lot of things that were similar, but things that were different. And I think from a practice perspective, and the idea of being aware of alternative pathways, and alternative pathways are incredibly common, alternative pathways into and through education, I should say, sorry. They're hugely common in the general population. So why wouldn't they be common within a group of people who've experience of being in care, you know? I think it's kind of changing a little bit, or just thinking about it a little bit differently, and this idea of educational outcomes as, you know, fixed in time is not, I don't think, and I'm not saying everyone thinks like that, but I think outcomes are actually a lot more diverse and lived and ongoing and more fluid than that, you know. So I often had this conversation with my supervisor where I would kind of think, you know, if I had interviewed everyone I spoke to when they were 21, I would have very different stories, or even 24. 5 years, 10 years, 15 years makes a huge difference in terms of the outcome. And I think that's a really important message around, you know, potential and hope and positivity, and, you know, it's possible, you know. And I think we, as kind of, you know, the research community or policymakers or practitioners, it's about developing this kind of way of thinking about it in those terms, I suppose. So that's a very long-winded message.
It's a
but
fantastic
I think
message. Because what you're saying is, you know, let's anticipate this and then we can work with it, rather than this continuing trying to put people into boxes, trying to make people do things before they're ready, and then people not making it. And, you know, if we know that we have this very varied route into education, and like you say, so does a lot of people, then why don't we anticipate that and work with that? And the key thing there for me that's the problem is the whole notion of corporate parenting. Because if I think about my own children who haven't gone on to university, they're 20 and 22, at some point in their life, if they want to, and I'm in a position to help them in some way, I will.
Yeah.
And that
when
is
they're ready.
When they're ready.
If they want to,
Yeah. Because of my own educational journey, I'm really okay with them doing that when they like, if they like, you know? And that's the difference. That's the challenge that we have, because of course corporate parenting actually has a lifespan and an end, and that makes it quite challenging. But that's not our challenge for today. But I think not for today, but I'd just like to sort of leave that there, because I think that to me seems to be one of the challenges and tensions that we may not have an answer to, but I think let's at least be open about what that tension is and how that plays out and how it impacts and affects across the life course.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that life course perspective on it, that longer term thinking about it, is kind of, you know, a route into thinking about maybe ideas of corporate parenting and things like that slightly differently, that it is this maybe lifetime role. You know, my parents are still my parents. I don't tell you what age I am, but, you know, I'm certainly not a child anymore. And I think, you know, it would be really wonderful if that became how we thought about children, young people and adults who've been in care, you know. So I agree with you.
Yeah. So where can people find you on Twitter? What's your Twitter?
Yes. Oh my
handle?
goodness, my Twitter handle is at EavanRB, so it's at EAVANRB. And you can also, I mean, I guess if you just Google me, there actually aren't very many Eavan Bradys. There's one other lady who makes a lot of cupcakes, I think I found on Google, but I'm the other one. And if you go to Trinity College Dublin's website and search for me, my kind of profile will come up there with my email address and publications and things like that and research interests. So I'm always delighted to be contacted by people. And you were saying before about, you know, the power of Twitter, and it's been amazing to see people like yourself and other people in the UK accessing the article and getting like live feedback on your work, which is incredible, you know. So I'm always delighted to hear from anybody who has comments or questions or anything like that. So yeah, can I say thank you so much for having me, Lisa? This has been a really wonderful experience. My first podcast.
Oh, amazing. There's no way that I was going to leave you not sharing your work. Not a chance. Not a chance. It's been so good to talk to you, and I'm always going to remember Robbie's "We measure what we treasure." I don't know how I've not heard it before.
I don't know. I must ask him because I don't actually know if it's his own phrase or if he got it from somewhere. But I think it's so relevant in this context, you know. So yeah, I'll tell him you like it.
Thank you very much. Yes. Now listen, you have a fantastic day, and thank you ever so much for coming onto the podcast.
Thank you so much, Lisa. Take care. Have a nice day. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.